в мировой поэзии, как школа языка или language poetry. Это школа, которая предполагает, что главным фокусом поэтической речи, главной проблематикой темы поэтического говорения является сам поэтический язык. И в результате поэтической практики язык политизируется, приобретает социальное, этическое, эстетическое измерение. Да? То есть политика, этика, антропология, человеческое, нечеловеческое вырастает изнутри языка. И вот школа языка – это одно из магистральных направлений, явлений в американской мировой поэзии в 70-е, 80-е, 90-е годы. С 78 по 82 год Чарльз Бернстин был одним из редакторов журнала Language, являющимся рупором Language School. Да? И сегодня Чарльз Бернстин расскажет о основных стилистических параметрах, эстетических тенденциях языковой школы, о некоторых вот этапах ее развития. И кроме того, вот тот вопрос, который нас особенно занимает, это вопрос радикальной политизации поэтического образа, который происходит в языке. И начнем мы нашу беседу, встречу с Чарльзом Бернстином. В заключение вы можете задать вопросы. И беседа эта будет проходить не в совсем такой вот стандартной лекционной форме, поскольку она будет сопровождаться чтениями. Вот. И начнем мы с такого вот эпиграфа, который предложил Чарльз. Мы прочитаем одно стихотворение, строчка за строчкой.
How many people? It's good to be here, and I want to thank Dimitri and the people in New Holland for inviting me here. I was here in St. Petersburg in 2001, in the summer of 2001, to visit Arkady Dragomoshenko, and we also read together in Helsinki just before that. That was the only reading that we did together in Helsinki. And Arkady came to Buffalo, where I worked in 1993, and he spent the semester there, and I saw him a number of other times in New York. So I'm glad that Zina is here today. I want to, the first thing, just to say how sad I am that he is not here, but I feel his presence in what I do and being here in St. Petersburg. He was a very crucial figure for me, and I love his poetry. So I thought that this work with a translation by Ian Probstein would be a good epigraph and respond to the panel before. How many people are listening to this on the headphones with the simultaneous translation? Oh, so, all right. Now I'm going to try to make it very hard so he won't be able to really translate what I'm doing. And I think this is almost impossible for you to do, right? So you're going to have to listen sometimes just to me speaking in English very, very fast. But he did. A little test. That was supposed to be funny. And in this segment, you're allowed to laugh. I'm against poetry as being serious. I'm against poetry that's spiritual. As you'll see. Okay, but you're going to have to read. We only have the one page. This line. This line is stripped of emotion. This line is no more than an illustration of a Russian theory. This line is bereft of a subject. This line has no reference apart from its context in this line. This line is only about itself. This line has no meaning. Its words are imaginary. It sounds inaudible.
В этой строке нет смысла. Слова ее мнимы, звуки неразличимы.
This line cares not for itself or for anyone else. It is indifferent, impersonal, cold, uninviting.
Эту строку не заботит ни она сама, ни что-либо. Она безразлична, безлична, непривлекательна, холодна.
This line is elitist, requiring to understand it years of study in stultifying libraries, poring over esoteric treatises on impossible-to-pronounce topics.
Эта строка элитарна для понимания, требует многолетнего изучения в утупляющих библиотеках, чтения эзотерических трактатов по темам, которые не выговорить.
This line refuses reality.
Эта строка отрицает реальность. Маленькое объявление. Кто пришел, сейчас, пожалуйста, возьмите наушники, потому что лекция будет синхронным переводом.
So, the first thing I'm going to read is the introduction to my most recent book. It's called The Pitch of Poetry. And the translator wrote me a note yesterday and said, how can I translate this simultaneously or otherwise, because everything has multiple meanings and it's very literary. It's kind of like a poem. And I said to him, don't worry. Just say, here there's some kind of word play going on that has something to do with object status of language, post-media, pre-media. It's all basically. But the word pitch is very interesting to me, and I think does relate to this question of the human. Because pitch of poetry is the name of the book. Pitch is like making a sales pitch, trying to sell you something. That's one sense. A pitch of poetry has many essays about individual poets. Pitch also, though, means black, dark, gummy, thick, dirty, that you can't get out. Like you could say pitch dark or the pitch of night. But pitch is the black, gummy stuff. And pitch also means balance, like on a boat, the pitch of a boat going back and forth, the balance. So those are, and pitch is also, in baseball, it's the throwing of the ball by the pitcher to the batter, the pitch. So it means all of those things. And here's the introduction. Here's the pitch, black and thick. The confidence man selling, but not a bill of goods. The pitch itself, only this and nothing more. Pitch is the foul stain, the skank and stench of a viscous taint. The kind of poetry I want is when you can't get the pitch out. Poetry's the thing with feathers, tethers, tarred on, as in Edgar Allan Poe's system of tar and feathering, fathering. The kind of poetry I want gums up the works, a tangle of truths. This is the scandal of poetry, not the one but the many, not the many becoming one, but the one becoming many. Appearance precedes essence the way purpose is a perfume and being late to school a blessing. I'm not a hell of a poet, but a poet for the hell of it. Diego Macchiera tells me one sunny spring day in Santiago. I'm self-untaught, I replied. Back home in Brooklyn, its deepest fall. The politics of poetic form is no politics at all, but it's the only politics that can't be taken away, the cartilage of the body poetic. Who am I kidding? Mostly myself. That's whom. So come on, let's beat that dead horse until we're blue-faced or green with envy or just whistling old tunes that we make up in the pitch dark of the night, until the rhythm becomes alive, if not to us, then to that part of ourselves we no longer recognize. No man is himself, even to an island, nor woman neither. Obviousness is the hobgoblin of common sense. You can't represent what you can't think, and thinking is nothing near what it's made to do. What's done's undone in the twist of a phrase or a catchy image. The past is just as lost as our love is. Our love was. Ontological pitching, a metaphysical lurch or stagger. Here, not here. Here, not here. Heard, not heard. Taught, untaught. Gently rapping, and then it's all you can make out. Abstraction is the dream of figuration, just as lines are a way of marking time till the sentence is over. Unheard melodies are celestial demographics. Even if you can't put your finger on it, you can still pretend to count. You go to the club in the evening only to be clubbed at dawn. How long has this been going on? There's more than one way to fleece a sheep, but only one way to stop. Echo poetics is the non-linear resonance of one motif bouncing off another within an aesthetics of constellation. Even more, it's the sensation of illusion in the absence of illusion. In other words, the echo I'm after is a blank, a shadow of an absent source, a network of stopgaps. Even my explanations need explication, my commentaries, elucidations, my prefaces, glosses, my shadows, shadows. Truth be, I'm afraid of my own shadow. This book starts by interweaving threads from metaphors for abstraction and representation to the poetics of cultural dissent. Language, the magazine, gives a historical and archival ground for the often speculative essays. Pitch is the sound of poetry, but pitch is also the attack or approach, the angle. Pitch in the sense of register. Poets catch my ear because of their pitch. I prefer live wires to retread tires. In the second section of this book, I provide a brief account of such more perfect pitches, the poem as conceptual scheme, poetics as scam or scum. This is followed by a series of conversations that echo and extend, ravel and ruffle my threads until, in the final section, they end into kind of threnody. Echo poetics is dialogic critical encounters. Pataquerix is the arena of the excluded. This book concludes with a wild pitch, low and outside, for the aesthetic, which still, I hope, strikes responsive chords. The value of a poem's pitch is not in the words, but what the words allow for a reader. As valuable as poems are for themselves, this value is eclipsed by what they may foment in intensified perceptual, conceptual experience. So let's pitch in. Let's pitch in. You and I may be referring to the same thing, but the thing's not the same. We'll bridge that cross when we come to it. Let's take play into our hands rather than becoming its plaything. For instance, what happens when you realize that the devil underfoot might not be the problem? That Satan is dressed as if it were Saint Michael. The issue is not identification with the downtrodden, but recognition that even the best angel is a diabolic dialogic angle. But some would rather curse the light than put it out. Is it an error to think my reliance on error is an error? A mirror is better than most art. I like poets who are clutch hitters, who can knock the ball out of the park, score tied, bases loaded. It's the wind-up. So the translation itself, of course, is a kind of echo, in the sense that I mean, echo poetics. So I could look at the translator now and just do this echo all day. I don't have to do anything else except that. Just the echo and the sound of the echo. But you didn't bring me here all the way from Brooklyn for that. Oh, that's the introduction. So this is one of the sections of the piece, and it addresses Dimitri's interest in politics. I'm a little bit interested in the politics of American social space and some of the foundational ideas of American democracy, and which I think is, for me coming here, I'm always struck by everything being reversed in some way because of the Cold War, which I grew up in and am still in, even though I was told that it was over. It's not over for me. So take that in this light. So this section is called In Unum Pluribus. So the motto of the United States of America is E pluribus unum. In unum pluribus reverses that. Toward a more perfect invention. And more perfect is from Emerson. It's Emerson's idea that we never arrive at perfection. We never get to some final place, but are on the road. On March 18th, 2008, presidential candidate Barack Obama gave one of his most resonant speeches. His subject was, to use a phrase of Langston Hughes, America and the Racial Mountain. Obama's speech was titled More Perfect Union, a phrase he often used in speeches during his campaign and early in his presidency. I suppose I just mentioned because that's the beginning of the Declaration of Independence in the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. So one of the most famous phrases. More perfect is the sign of Ralph Waldo Emerson's moral perfectionism, to use the contemporary American philosopher Stanley Cavell's term, for Emerson's view that while we move toward provisional goals, we do well not to fret about arriving at a destination. We dwell in process and betray that process if our orientation is toward predetermined results. Our journeys don't end. Our business is unfinished. Our poems open upon ever new poems. More perfect is a direction, a movement, not the final state of idealized perfection. The poetics here is ethical, not moral, dialogic and situational rather than fixed and rule-bound. Obama's speech begins with a slight truncation of the opening words of the preamble in the U.S. Constitution. He allies of the United States. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, not a perfect one, but a more perfect one, with an emphasis on process rather than final destination, ever more perfect, never achieving perfection. It's no wonder Emerson's moral perfectionism is called pragmatic. We do the best we can. Obama's poetics are explicit. This is from Obama. We perfect our union by understanding that we have many different stories, but we hold common hopes. We may not look the same, and we may not have come from the same place, but we all want to move in the same direction. Without saying the word, Obama continues by holding forth the truth of miscegenation, race mixing, of the syncretic, as the promise of a more perfect union. I am the son of a black man from Kenya and a white woman from Kansas. And this is the grace note on which he ends his speech. This is where perfection begins. We are always at that beginning. It is the promise of America. So here today at this New Holland conference, with the themes new urbanization, the politics of the signifier, and dialogue, allow me to recast our U.S. national anthem, E pluribus unum, from many one, in the name of ever-changing dialogic poetics of the Americas, as in unum pluribus, in one many, but also in pluribus unum, within many one. The question of what kind of union or unity exists in the diverse poetries of the Americas is vexing but rewarding. It is a founding question for the poetics of the Americas. This next part is a brief excerpt from a discussion of the poetics around Language magazine with equal signs, L equals A was our logo. Language magazine, which I edited with Bruce Andrews, published its first issue in 1978 and its last in 1982. In our preface to the Language book, we provided a summary of our editorial project. Throughout, we have emphasized a spectrum of writing that places its attention primarily on language and ways of making meaning, that takes for granted neither vocabulary, grammar, process, shape, syntax, program, or subject matter. All of these remain at issue, focusing on this range of poetic exploration and on related aesthetic and political concerns. We have tried to open things up beyond correspondence and conversation, to break down some unnecessary self-encapsulation of writers, person from person, and scene from scene, and to develop more fully the lattice work of those involved in aesthetically related activity. At its most fundamental level, language was an editorial action, a frame for selecting and combining a range of disparate poetic practice and critical thinking. We didn't capture an already existing, fully formed aesthetic as much as participate in its creation. The approaches to poetry explored in language emerged in the 1970s in several small magazines and presses and in a number of local reading series. Language poetry in its many different names. Language poetries, language writing, language-centered writing, so-called language writing, mark different frames of a field of poetic activity that has no unified stylistic consistency. Bruce Andrews' epithet, so-called, suggests an ongoing ambivalence about labeling. For one of the many obsessions of one faction of this poetic constellation was a resistance to or phobia of naming, characterization, and standardized modes of representation. So the description in part this description is in part problematic, and it remains an open question whether this constellation of activity was a movement or school, aesthetic tendency, or convenient label, and whether the names for the phenomena were insulting labels or a standard for group solidarity. For some of the practitioners and advocates, the local scene played a fundamental role. For others, it was a set of defining aesthetic principles, while for others still the most important thing was the exchange across geographic borders. All three aspects are vital to the story. Overall, there was a commitment to poetry as a social activity and an equal commitment to exchange value as the value of individual work. Language was a site of conversation about a set of marked issues, a place to air differences but not necessarily to settle them. That conversation was radically distinct from the values of the official verse culture of the time, not only in terms of what poetry is, what it does, and how it works, but also in terms of the commitment to group and community formation through conversation. Language and the poetry and poetics surrounding it was formed in controversy and remained controversial because its unity was not a set of agreed-upon aesthetic principles, but rather an aversion to the conservative dogma of much of the dominant poetry of the time. Yet despite its unruliness, the ensemble of activities that falls under this rubric does share a family resemblance, to use Wittgenstein's term. Both the poetry and poetics posed a stark alternative to the prize poetry of the era. Language made a turn from some aspects of modernist avant-garde formations, staying clear of univocal manifestos, though not from polemic intervention. This is not to say that social or aesthetic insularity or the promotion of particular styles was not present, but that it was never the governing, nor was it the defining principle. Indeed, a pervasive wariness about, combined with a peculiar devotion to some of the more doctrine aspects of the modernist avant-garde formations, was one of the constituent interests in the formation of work in and around language. Language primarily focused on poets from US and Canada born from the mid-1930s to the mid-1950s. Some of these poets had a greater affiliation with the project than others. You can call them fellow travelers. And some were more averse to affiliation. Both pulls, one to the idiosyncratic and the other toward group solidarity, are consistent, are constituent of the field. It is my intention to note the contributions across the spectrum. So you could say Michael Palmer, who was here recently, and Sasha Skadan has translated, was more resistant to any kind of group solidarity on the one hand, and people like me more ambivalent, and others more gung-ho. So this is just a list I thought was interesting in respect to the panel just now and the different kinds of activities that we could call post-media that was talked about. And these are some of the things I think going on in North American poetry. The multilectical and the multilingual. So this is macaronic work that exists in more than one language. Site-specific fieldwork, appropriation via transcription, reframing, and reciting, web data mining, eco-poetics, both eco-poetics in the sense of ecological and my sense of echo, exploring the reciprocal relationship between the human and the non-human, world and earth, as well as a practice of mimicry and repetition within and across human cultures and languages, omnidirectional, homophonic, and heteroglossic translation, transcreation, and remediation, including transposition, resetting, and restaging across platforms, so the poetics of translation in its most radical sense. Constraint-based work. ESL, writing English by those from non-English regions via web-intensified global affinity clusters, and also abetted by machine translations between language to sort of take over English so that it's not thought that you can write American poetry because you're a native English speaker, but to imagine the more radical idea would be that English poetry and English language poetry would be taken over by non-English speakers as a global language and not allow that nativism to persist. Poetry and programmable media, so this is what was discussed earlier, of course, by Natalia and others in terms of post-media or media poetics. Sound performance in as recording, deformations, rearticulations of the audio archive. So this relates to my biggest archival project at Penn Sound, where we have poets, hundreds of different poets, audio recordings of their readings. A collaboration and syntactic involution. Along with these are newly emerging in the broad area of bent poetics. This is my term for my general field of action, bent poetics. Disability and the defamiliar and imaginary body, identity formations as in textual sexual medium, queerancies, nude formalisms, that is to say distressed or demented metrical poetry, junk space, ambience, idiolect, which is the use of slang understood as, or dialect understood as, an ideological project, sprung lyric, mixed syncretic poetic genres, modularities, the collaboration between music and poetry, and also visual poetry and art and book art. So the very short final section from the book that I'm reading is just a tiny bit
from what's the long, it's just like it's from a very, very long essay. And the essay has a kind of a peculiar title. It's the Pataquerical Imagination, Midrashic Antinomianism, and the Promise of Bent Studies. So, Pataquerical combines Alfred Jarry's idea of pataphysics, the swerve. The Midrashic is a Jewish commentary on, really, to me, an empty center. So you just have the commentary. Because that would be the antinomian, which is against religious law as prescribed by the minister authority, knowing the truth for oneself. It's also very important. Emily Dickinson is a kind of American Christian antinomianism. So Midrashic antinomianism is a somewhat funny combination. And some of you may recognize the appropriation in the first sentence here. A specter is haunting official verse culture. The specter of pataquericalism. All the forces have entered into a Nepo-humanist alliance to exercise the specter. I need to define, because it comes up about post-humanism or non-human or anti-humanism, this term I've invented. Nepo-humanism, N-E-P-O, it's like using the word nepotistic, like the only people who are human are the people that are your relatives or the people you like, your ethnic group or your cronies. There's variations of that I call necro-humanism and hypo-humanism. So universalizes one's immediate preferences while stigmatizing as barbaric those that are not immediately intelligible. So this whole essay is really about the stigma, really about the barbaric, the way in which humanism is almost always nepo-humanistic. It tends to cast out people who, as not human, as non-human others, those who don't fit into your view of humanism. And this, for me, is the fundamental to the dominant strains within American poetry, which I call official verse poetry. So, and associated with the main organs of dissemination, such as the New Yorker, the Pulitzer Prize, the New York Review of Books, and so on. Over the past decade, the stranglehold of Cold War scenic voice poems. So this Cold War is a kind of an obsession of mine, and it's interesting to talk about here. And it's certainly true of the way in which Russian poets and communist bloc poets were put forward in the United States, often against what their actual work was like. But the singular individual voice that fights against the totalitarianism of the Soviet Union, not indigenous intolerance and racism in the United States, but always the anti-communism. And then the poet was this voice of individual, lyric, human resistance to this totalitarianism from somewhere else, not the totalitarianism from within. So that, to me, is the dynamic I'm always caught up in, that Cold War, because I grew up in that. Some of you are a little after that, and that's, just as well. Over the past 2 decades, the stranglehold of Cold War scenic voice poems has loosened under the pressure of literary interventions of language, such as I mentioned, and its partisans to let a soupçon of flowers bloom in official verse culture greenhouses. The forms demonized a few decades ago are now embraced as a mark of new inclusiveness, a fair and balanced approach to poetry styles, marking not the end to poetic ideology, but an indefinite cessation. So my argument is always that the attack on innovative poetry as being dogmatic and ideological marks the constant repression of the ideological formation of official verse poetry. Everybody else is ideological but you, because you're a humanist with a universal voice of your feelings. It is time that pataquericalists should openly, in the face of the whole poetry world, display their views, parade their aims, parody their tendencies, and meet this old husband's tale of the specter of men's studies with a whoosh and a higgly hoop and a he, ho, ha. The history of all hitherto existing poetry is the history of pataquarical struggles, normal and perverse, hybrid and vernacular, metered and unmetered, versed and averse, national and barbaric, couth and uncouth, proper and wrong, manly and unmanly, black and white, Jew and goy, pigeon and sparrow, fancy and imagination, miscegenated and pure, assimilated and idiolectical, dominated and dominatrix, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of poetry at large or in the triumph of the mediocrity. The modern necro-humane society that has spouted from the ruins of poetry wars has not done away with these antagonisms. It has established new hybrids, new conditions of normalcy, new forms of correctness in place of the old ones. So the final part that I'm going to do now is a tribute to Alexei Parchakov, who I knew a little bit, but not as well as I would have liked. I only met him once and hardly had a conversation with him. It was only really after he died that I began to know about his later work, which seemed amazing to me. And so it turned out that he, not consulting me, but he, and we'll hear more about this in a second, did a translation of this 3,000-word poem of mine from 30 years ago. It's exactly 30 years now. I think I finished it in 86, 31 years, called Artifice of Absorption. So we're going to read the beginning and the end of that. And let me just address what I was trying to do overall in that essay. For one thing, it is really a poem, and it's a poem in verse. It's an essay in verse, you could say. So I try to use the techniques of the poem to emphasize the alienation effect, what Victor Shklovsky refers to as "Ostrani, ostrana." Life goes on, boys. La 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 la. That's very interested in this guy, Victor Shklovsky, as were my friends, and he's a presiding spirit in the essay, in the poem, and also Velimir Klebnikov, who I was just reading for the first time in translation in the 70s. You know, there was a first time that came out, and the Russian futurists in general had an enormous impact on me and my friends, Krushnik and Popova and so on. So these were very powerful works. I thought I would read you just for fun my translation for the 100th anniversary of Incantation by Laughter, so you'll recognize this version. This is another echo. I'm going to play this back to you. I'm interested to see if our simultaneous translator could translate this back into the original, but I think probably we could stop that for the moment. We laugh with our laughter, loke laugher and loafer sloth, larker int leffer lop lapter, loofer loop slapper lassler pin lap loper ek lipper bloop oofer oter floop flapper eb flooper foot lickless and sickles ek laughing lushing loofing ip looping lippling gas sprickling laughter laughing laughter. So there's a good part of the poem which actually talks about issues of opacity versus universality, because so many of I was really so more interested in materializing and making language more opaque, but of course Zhao was the opposite in some ways, but still because of its universal, desire, very beautiful essays. But nonetheless, the work itself could be the same. So I'm always interested in this. It's something that might seem opaque or impermeable could also have the opposite effect. So artificial absorption is really about the question of being absorbed, and how most conventional poetry with a deep meaning and so on was actually quite superficial to me and boring and didn't absorb me at all. And that to really have absorptive language, one had to have more friction, more activity, more things that some readers found meaningless and opaque. And my plea really is that is against the idea of meaningless. And a lot of poets embrace the idea of meaninglessness. I think that it's just different forms of meaning and different ways of framing meaning that allow for different kinds of meaning to occur. So a lot of the poem is about that. Just in respect to the question of object theory that Dimitri, in terms of what I would say is the history of that, and Skidan as well, and how all the people in the beginning sort of talked about it. I would, of course, mention Mallarmé on the one hand. He's the figure that for the French look one way, but from an American point of view seems to open up the space, seems to materialize a language. For the French, he often seems like the end of hexameter, the end of the 19th century, but for us, differently. And then in modernist American poetry, William Carlos Williams and his famous poem is a small or large machine made of words and materializing a language. And then most radically, Gertrude Stein, who really did something that nobody had done with verbal language before in terms of not having a representation, creating language constructions. Then the other thing that emerges, since you talk so much about object and the object status of the medium, or at least from the translations that I could hear in terms of object theory, would be the American poets, so-called objectivist poets, Louis Zukofsky, who was born in 1904, Charles Reznikoff, who was born about 10 years earlier, George Oppen. These are really Jewish American modernism. You could also talk about them, and Zukofsky's definition of objectification, his interest in objectification was also combined with sincerity. That the poem, that they were interested in creating poems that didn't have speaking subjects, that were not people speaking, but were the actual word stuff on the page, and that the objectification was to remove the speaking subject, and that the sincerity was the truth in the way you dealt with that material. Sincerity was the test of the poem, that you dealt with this material without words as an object status, but the object status wouldn't be sufficient. It had to have this additional thing, sincerity. And his example is Reznikoff in that essay. Charles Reznikoff's work is his example. Reznikoff used many found sources for his work, and he's really great, but not fully recognized American poet. One thing that sort of interests me in my later reading of Russian poetry would put, and I'll just say this is one sentence, Mandelstam together with Zukofsky. I think one of the reasons that we have these national literatures, of course, they were one American and the other Russian, I suppose, but some of those categories break down in a way. I mean, my grandparents were from near here, I suppose. I don't know where, but probably maybe over there, could be back there. We don't really know. And Zukofsky, too, he was the same age as my father. His parents also were from closer to this part of the world. And I think that the aspects that Mandelstam and Zukofsky share that would change the way we look at them both. But I'll leave it to that. And when Mark is here, and yeah. So he's going to give you, we'll just end with reading the beginning passage and one of the end passages from it, but he'll talk for a moment about the process of the translation, because he's one of the three people that did this work. Yeah. You want to start? And you want to say something first? Yeah. I'll read the English. Yeah. That's right. Just exactly in the line by line. No. Yeah. I hear what you're saying. Not line.
Ну, я должен сказать, что это был своеобразный опыт, который мы пережили вместе с Лешей Парщиковым и Патриком Генри. Дело в том, что перевод этой поэмы был своеобразным примирением нашим с Алешей Парщиковым, с которым мы лет 15 не общались. причем не поругавшись, а как-то это было просто вот такое расхождение в пространстве и времени. И когда после того, как мы вдруг снова стали очень активно дружить, он, находясь в Германии, предложил мне и Патрику Генри, который в это время находился в Москве, сделать перевод поэмы. Вот он был ужасно заинтересован в том, чтобы перевести ее на русский язык. И, честно говоря, я немножко был в недоумении, но мне хотелось сделать что-то такое в ответ Леше, пойти ему навстречу. И чтобы закрепить наше примирение, может быть, если бы не это, я бы даже и отказался участвовать в этом. Я был нужен скорее как человек, у которого есть филологическое образование. У Леши было условное такое филологическое образование, он окончил Литинститут, а я все-таки учился на кафедре структурной лингвистики в университете. И Леша был не очень уверен в том, что он сумеет адекватно это перевести, особенно какие-то вот такие филологического характера части этой поэмы. Но самое главное, что у нас был Патрик Генри, который учился в Беркли, и который говорил английский был его родной язык, а по-русски он был очень классно. И, в общем, это был такой очень хороший, удачный опыт. И в результате, хотя я не очень охотно втягивался в эту работу, в результате этой работы я ощутил довольно интересную для себя вещь. Я вдруг увидел американскую поэзию изнутри глазами американца, потому что там такое большое количество материала разных времен, слоев американской культуры, что я, как русский поэт, который смотрит на это немножко со стороны, дистанционно и издалека, со средней степенью заинтересованности, я просто никогда бы этого не ощутил, если бы не занят был этим переводом. Я в конце концов этим увлекся и был очень рад, что я в этом участвовал. К сожалению, перевод этот пришелся на такое время в русской поэзии, когда пространство атомизировалось, резонанс очень сильно от всего, что происходило, очень сильно сокращался. Хотя вот нам удалось ее издать сначала в журналах, потом вот она вышла отдельной книжкой. Кому-то это было довольно-таки интересно. Я же жалею, что вот нам не удалось сделать это еще более информативным. Сделать больше информации о том, что эта поэма переведена и существует. Это все, что я могу сказать в начале. Я готов читать с вами.
And also it's included in the catalog that you put out. Some of it is included in this catalog that you can get. You say that you were perplexed by this work, and I also am perplexed. In fact, one of my criteria, especially for essays, is that if I have a stanza or a paragraph that doesn't perplex me, I have to rewrite it until I'm perplexed. If I understand myself what it is that I'm saying, then I don't see the point. So the perplexity is necessary. But let's now read some sections. This is the opening, near the opening anyway. The reason it is difficult to talk about meaning, the reason it is difficult to talk about the meaning of a poem in a way that doesn't seem frustratingly superficial and partial is that by designating a text a poem, one suggests that its meanings are to be located in some complex beyond an addition of devices and subject matters. A poetic reading can be given to any piece of writing. A poem may be understood as writing specifically designated to absorb or inflate with proactive rather than reactive styles of reading. Artifice is a measure of a poem's intractability to being read as the sum of its devices and subject matters. In this sense, artifice is the contradiction of realism, with its insistence on presenting an unmediated, immediate experience of facts, either of the external world of nature or of the internal world of the mind. For example, naturalistic representation or phenomenological consciousness mapping. Facts in poetry are primarily factitious.
Причина по которой трудно говорить о смысле стихотворения в ракурсе, не кажущемся удручающе поверхностным или мелочным, состоит в том, что уже самой маркировкой текста как стихотворения подразумевается, что его смыслы следует искать вне плана освоенных приемов и содержаний. Поэтическое прочтение приложимо к любой разновидности сочинительства, тогда как стихотворение, в кавычках, почти всегда понимается как сочинительство, специфически нацеленное на впитывание или наполнение скорее активными, чем нейтральными способами считывания. Изощренность – это мера неподатливости стихотворения быть прочтенным как простая сумма приемов и содержаний. В этом смысле изощренность препятствует реализму в его настоятельных претензиях на непосредственную передачу фактов независимо внешней окружающей действительности или внутренней действительности ума, примером чему могут служить натуралистический способ изображения или феноменологическая сценограмма сознания. Факты в поэзии главным образом искусственны.
These comments are partly intended as caution against thinking of formally active poems as eschewing content or meaning, even in the face of the difficulty of articulating just what this meaning is. That is, the meaning is not absent or deferred, but self-embodied as the poem in a way that is not transferable to another code or rhetoric. At the same time, it is possible to evoke various contours of meaning, by metaphorically considering the domains made real by various formal considerations.
Эти замечания предназначены отчасти в качестве предупреждения против осмысления формально активных стихотворений, как избегающих содержания или смысла, даже перед лицом сложности в артикуляции именно того, в чем этот смысл состоит. То есть смысл не отсутствует или отодвигается, но самовоплощается как стихотворение непереносимым в другой код или риторику образом. В то же время можно вызывать различные очертания смысла, метафорически рассматривая области, реализующиеся в разнообразных формальных конфигурациях.
And this is the end part. The thickness of writing between reader and the poem is constitutive for the poem of its visibility, and for the reader of the outer limit of his or her absorption in the poem. It is not an obstacle between them, it is their means of communication. The thickness of writing, far from rivaling that of the world, is, on the contrary, the sole means it has to go to the heart of things by making itself part of the material world, absorbed by it. As writers, and everyone ascribes in the sense I mean here, we can try to intensify our relationships by considering how they work. Are we putting each other to sleep or waking each other up? And what do we wake to? Does our writing stun or sting? Do we cling to what we've grasped too well or find tunes in each new departure?
Плотность текста произведения, соотношение между читателем и стихотворением составляет для стихотворения его визуальность, а для читателя внешнюю границу его или ее вовлеченности в стихотворение. Это не препятствие между ними, это их способ коммуникации. Плотность текста далека от соперничества с миром. Напротив, это единственное средство, которое у него есть, чтобы дойти до сердцевины вещей, делая себя частью материального мира, поглощенной им. Как писатели, каждый из нас вписывается в смысл, который я здесь подразумеваю. Мы можем пытаться интенсифицировать свои отношения, рассматривая как они работают. Прогружаем ли мы друг друга в сон или пробуждаем один другого? И что нас ждет при пробуждении? Ошеломляет ли наше письмо или ранит? Цепляемся ли мы за то, что нам слишком легко дается, или подбираем мелодии в каждой новой отправной точке? Я хотел только два слова добавить. Здесь те куски, которые выбрал Чарльз, это такие куски наиболее эмоциональные и такого общего, даже я бы сказал, идеологического плана. Но эта поэма насыщена огромным материалом из американской поэзии, причем разновременным, и с интересным анализом, с интересным подходом к ним. И это, конечно, она гораздо богаче, даже я бы сказал, того, что мы сегодня прочли.
Thank you.